So starting with transport in animals, when we are talking about the transport, we know that it is done primarily by our cardiovascular system. A cardiovascular system is composed of, for you guys know, it's composed of a heart, and along with that, it is composed of your blood vessels. So when we are going to talk about it, uh, we know that we have generally two types of circular system, right? We have, okay, first of all, there's when we are talking about it, there is closed system and open system, right? That is one way. Open system is generally what you have when you have your when you have, for example, your insects. So in a closed system, the blood is not restricted to blood vessels. There are technically no blood vessels. You have the blood is freely flowing around in these empty spaces. And it's generally seen in very small organisms like insects. Because in insects, you do not have a large body. The body is very small, so the nutrients and the oxygen can easily diffuse out, and the metabolic demand is also low. So that is an open system. And the second type of system that you can have is a closed system, where the blood is actually restricted in your blood vessels. So that is the system we have. In your closed system, again, you can have a single circulatory system or a double circulatory system. When we are going to talk about it, a single circulatory system is when the blood passes through the body once, right? It passes through the body once. A double circulatory system is when the blood is passing through the heart twice in one cycle. The blood is passing through the heart twice in one cycle, and that this is a single circulatory system. The blood is directly passing from the heart into your gills, and from the gills it is so I have written gills over here because you can see single circulatory system in fishes. Okay, so you can find it in the gills, and directly from the gills it will go to the rest of the body, and then it will return back to the heart. So it is passing through the heart only once in the entire cycle. What we have is a double circulatory system. The double circulatory system means what? That the blood is first going to pass through the heart. It's first going to be pumped towards the lungs. Once the blood is in the lungs, it will get oxygenated. And after being oxygenated, it will come back to the heart. Okay, so it's being pumped to the heart, lungs, and then it will come back to the heart, and the heart will then pump it to the rest of the entire body. So in one cycle, the blood is passing through the heart twice, first to the lungs, and then it comes back to the heart, and then it goes to the rest of the body. When we are going to talk about it, when this blood is passing through the lungs, that is known as pulmonary circulation. Okay, that is known as pulmonary circulation when the blood is passing from the heart to the lungs. Then when the blood passes from the heart to the rest of the body, that is known as systemic circulation. Okay, so we have two types of circulation: pulmonary circulation, and the second one is going to be systemic circulation. So when we are going to talk about it, this is basically your basically the circulatory system that we have. Now, when we are going to talk about it, let's first go ahead and talk about the okay. Let's first go ahead and actually talk about the structure of the heart and how your cardiac cycle actually takes place. So when we are going to talk about the structure of the heart over here, you basically, if you remember, you guys remember it from your IG, So what we have is that it is divided into 4 chambers. The top 2 chambers are known as the atrium and the border chambers are known as the ventricle. Now, this side of the heart is the right side and this is the left side. Remember, it is always opposite to you. The diagram is always opposite to you. So what is your left side is going to be the diagram's right side. Remember that. So this will be the right side, that will be the left side. So this will be right ventricle, this will be, right atrium, this will be left atrium, this will be right ventricle, and this will be left ventricle. Then when we're going to talk about it, this is the vena cava. There are 2 branches of vena cava, the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava, when you're going to take a look into it, inferior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the lower body, from your arms, from your legs, from your abdomen. The inferior vena cava is going to bring the deoxygenated blood. The superior vena cava is going to bring deoxygenated blood from the head and neck. So specifically from the head and the neck, it is going to bring your deoxygenated blood. Inferior vena cava is going to bring it from the rest of the body. Along with that, so what happens? The blood is going to enter into the atrium. Okay. Along with this, while I'm telling you the structure of the heart, I'm also going to go ahead and give you remind you guys of the cardiac cycle. Okay. So what is going to end up happening is this, that the blood is going to enter into the atrium. As the blood is going to enter into the atrium, we have these valves. We have valves that are separating the atrium and the ventricle from each other. The function of this valve is, of course, to prevent the backflow of blood. So what will happen? The blood will enter into the atrium, and as it is going to enter into the atrium, your valves will open. These valves are known as atrioventricular valves. This is a general name for the valves that you can find between atrium and ventricle, and you can use this terminology for both the left side and the right side. Now, if you want to be more specific, whether you're talking about the valve of the right side or the left side, so specifically the valve of the right side is known as tricuspid valve, while the valve of the left side is known as the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. There are 2 names for it. So the valve of the left side can be known as either the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, while the valve on the right side is known as the tricuspid valve. So what is going to happen? The atrium is going to contract. Before it contracts, the tricuspid valves will open. So when the atrium is going to contract, the blood is going to end up passing on to the ventricle. Once the blood is in the ventricle, these tricuspid valves are going to close again. These tricuspid valves are going to close again. This ventricle is going to go ahead and it is going to contract. And the semilunar valve. So if you guys remember, in your pulmonary artery and in the aorta, you have semilunar valves. These semilunar valves will open and the blood will pass from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery also gives 2 branches, the left pulmonary artery, the right pulmonary artery. The right artery will go to the right lung, the left artery will go to the left lung. So the blood will pass onto the lung where it's going to get oxygenated. After being oxygenated, it will return back to your left atrium through the pulmonary vein. It will enter back into the left atrium through the pulmonary vein. And what is going to happen over here? Your atrium is going to again contract. The bicuspid valve or the mitral valve will open. The blood will pass from your right atrium to the left atrium to the left ventricle. Left ventricle will then contract. The tricuspid valve will close to prevent the backflow of blood. Bicuspid valve will close to prevent the backflow of blood. The semilunar valves will open and the blood will pass into the aorta, where it will then be carried out into the rest of the body. That is the entire cardiac cycle that we had previously studied. Now, we need to go ahead and take a look at the cardiac cycle in terms of our systole and in terms of our diastole. So when this is basically the chart of how the blood flow actually looks like. Now, when we are going to talk about it, systole means contraction. I'll write it down, systole. And diastole,
Yes.
yeah.
Do we have to memorize that thing, like how the blood flows like this year as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you have to memorize how the blood flows this year as well. It is important. It is not very important, but it is important. They are going to give you questions related to it.
Okay,
So,
so it's
yeah. So when you're going to go ahead and you're going to talk about over here, basically what is important, main thing that is important is what valves are opening when. Okay, that is very important. So they can literally give you like a whole graph, and they give you a graph and they go ahead and they ask you, identify what valve is opening over here. What valve is opening over here? So generally it's a graph of, let's say, changes in pressure. So how the pressure is changing in the ventricle, and then they ask you accordingly, or they give you the cardiac cycle graph and they say what valve is opening where. So for that, you definitely need to remember how the blood is circulating. So when we talk about cardiac cycle can be divided into two phases, the systole and the diastole. When we talk about systole is when the muscles are contracting. The muscles of the heart are known as cardiac muscles, by the way. Okay, they're known as cardiac muscles, and you and I will talk about what the structure of cardiac muscles are. So this is basically systole, and when the muscles are relaxing, that is going to be known as diastole. So in your entire system, you are going to start with first atrial systole. First, your atria are going to go ahead and contract. So you start with atrial systole, okay? And when you're going to talk about it, the atria are going to contract, so the blood can pass through from the atrium into the ventricles. So during this process, when the atria are contracting, the pressure that you're getting from the contraction is not very high. Like if you look at the graph, you guys will, and I will show you the graph in a bit, you guys are going to see that the pressure you're getting is not that high. The reason the pressure you're getting is not that high is, of course, because atrial walls are thin. And atrial walls are thin, and atrial walls they need to be thin. I mean, they don't have to be thin. They don't need to make any extra pressure because the blood only has to go towards the ventricle. That's it. It doesn't have to go anywhere else. So the walls are sufficient. After that, what is going to happen? After your atrial systole, you will then get ventricular systole. Ventricular systole is when the walls of the ventricle are going to contract, and as a result, the pressure is going to increase. So the pressure increase you will see with ventricular systole is going to be much, much, much more. That is because in your ventricular systole, the walls of the ventricles really thick. So they can really put pressure on the blood. And as soon as the pressure in the ventricle will be greater than the pressure in the atrium, the atrioventricular valves will close. As soon as the pressure in the ventricle is greater than that in the atrium, the AV valves will close, preventing the backflow of blood. So the blood cannot flow back into the atrium. So where will it go? It will go towards the pulmonary artery or the aorta. This process is happening simultaneously. When I told you first about the right side and the left side, but it is happening simultaneously. So both the atria will contract at the same time, and both the ventricle will contract at the same time. So both the ventricles will contract simultaneously, and the blood pressure will cause the semilunar valves to open, and the blood will enter into the aorta or into the pulmonary artery, depending upon the side. This is known as ventricular systole. So atrial systole is about 0.1 seconds. After 0.1 seconds, the blood is in the ventricle and ventricular systole will start. Ventricular systole is generally about 0.3 seconds. After that, you are going to move on to the next stage, that is ventricular diastole. So now the blood has entered into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Now the ventricle is going to relax. As the ventricle is going to relax, the pressure in the ventricle is going to drop. The pressure in the ventricle is going to drop. And what is going to happen? The high blood, so basically the semilunar valves opened because of the high blood pressure in the ventricle. Because there was a lot of blood pressure in the ventricle, it caused the semilunar valves to open. So now what is going to happen, that when your diastole is going to take place, the muscle is going to relax. So now the blood pressure inside the ventricle will drop because now all the blood is in the arteries. So what is going to happen, that this is going to cause the semilunar valves to close, so the blood cannot flow back into the ventricle, and as a result the blood will then pass on to the lungs or the rest of the body depending upon the side. So generally, when you say ventricular diastole can also be known as cardiac diastole. We can also use the term cardiac diastole because cardiac diastole is generally when the entire heart relaxes. So it's not just the ventricle that relaxes. Basically, the entire heart is going to go ahead and it is going to relax. So when what is going to happen? So during your ventricular diastole, I'm sorry, during ventricular diastole, the whole of the heart muscle is going to relax. Okay. So then what will happen when the whole heart is going to relax? Blood from the veins will flow into the two atria. So when the entire diastole is going to be happening, the entire heart is going to relax. Blood is now going to fall into the atria once again. The blood will once again start to enter the atria because right now the entire muscle has relaxed. Okay. Now the what is going to happen, that the blood is going to start entering into the atria, and as the blood is going to start into the coming back into the atria, the atria are going to contract again and the whole cardiac cycle will start once more. So these are the when you're going to talk about it, this is what your entire cardiac cycle is. Okay. So you guys have to go ahead and you guys have to remember what your when your valves are opening. You need to remember the entire cardiac cycle. So you do need to remember exactly where the blood is flowing, but now you guys have to remember it in this way. When what is happening in the systole, what of which valves are opening in the systole, where the blood is flowing. So you have to remember the same thing you studied in IG, how the blood flow is occurring, but now you have to relate it to the concept of systole or diastole. You can also perform this systole and diastole. Okay, there are different ways of pronouncing it. So you can pronounce this systole and diastole as well. So when you're going to go ahead and talk about it, in your ventricular systole, so when you're talking about your atrial systole, which valve is going to open? The atrioventricular valve, tricuspid and bicuspid. During your ventricular systole, what valve is going to open? AV valve is going to close and your semilunar valve is going to open. Okay, then during ventricular diastole, the semilunar valves are going to shut. So you guys have to remember that entire process. In atrial systole, the pressure of the blood is higher in the atrium compared to the ventricle. So the forces will cause the AV valves to open. In systole, the pressure of the blood is higher in the ventricle than in the atrium. So the high blood pressure inside the ventricle will push against the atrioventricular valve, push against the flaps or the cusp. You can call this cusp or you can call these flaps. So it will push against it and that is going to make it shut. And in ventricular systole, what else is going to happen? The high blood pressure inside the ventricle will not only close the AV valves, but it will open up the semilunar valves. And so the blood is going to pass on to the aorta and the pulmonary artery. As your ventricular diastole will occur, the entire heart is going to relax. So the pressure of the, so what's going to happen? Now there is less pressure of the blood in the ventricle and more pressure of the blood in the arteries. This is going to cause the blood to put pressure on the flaps, or the cusps of the semilunar artery, and the semilunar artery is going to close. So the entire story is happening because of changes in your blood pressure. And we have a graph related to this. Let me see if I can find it. Have I added it over here? Okay, hold on. Just give me 1 minute. I just need to add a graph, show you a graph. This is what the graph actually looks like. So they'll often give you this graph and they're going to go ahead and they're going to ask you to, first of all, thing that they can ask you is to, for example, calculate the heartbeat. Okay, that is one of the things they ask you to do. So what you have to see is, first of all, one complete cardiac cycle. So this over here that you are seeing, this is generally going to be your during your atrial systole. So this is going to be your atrial systole. Then this sudden increase in pressure is going to be during ventricular systole. And then this period where you're getting no increase in pressure, this is diastole. So atrial systole, ventricular systole, and then the diastole. So when you are going to talk about it, generally they're going to ask you to calculate the heartbeat. So to calculate the heartbeat, what you're going to do is this: you're going to calculate the time for one complete cardiac cycle. So starting from this all the way to this, starting from your systole all the way to your diastole, you are going to go ahead and see how much time is there. So once you've seen the time, so you will say, for example, it is taking 0.75 seconds for one heartbeat or for one cardiac cycle. So it's taking 0.75 seconds for one heartbeat. So how many heartbeats are you going to have in 60 seconds? 60 seconds is 1 minute. So that is how you can go ahead and basically calculate your heartbeat. So you can go ahead and do 60 divided by 0.75, and that's giving you, in this situation, around 80 beats per minute. So you're going to end up getting your answer something like this. Secondly, they can give you a graph and they can go ahead and ask you to identify the opening and closing of the valves. So at this particular point, when you see over here, this is basically when your AV valves are going to close and your semilunar valves are going to open. Okay, this line on the top is your aortic pressure. This line is the atrium pressure and this is the ventricular pressure. Okay, so as you can see, this is during atrial systole. So the atrial systole over here, over your AV valves are going to be open. Then over here, you can see your ventricle is the one that is contracting. So over here at this point, when the ventricle starts to contract, you are going to, over here, you are basically going to have your AV valves are going to open and semilunar valves, AV valves are going to close and semilunar valves will open. AV valves are going to close, semilunar valve is going to open at this point where the aortic pressure is increasing. So when you are going to talk about it, what is basically going to happen? that your over here the AV valves are basically going to open up, and hold on one second. So AV valves are going to open, the pressure in the ventricle is going to start to increase. Okay. Then when you're going to reach this point, what is going to happen? That at this point, the AV valves will close, semilunar valves are going to open. And as the semilunar valves are going to open, the pressure in the aorta is going to start to increase. Okay. And what is going to happen after that? If your semilunar valves are going to close, the pressure in the ventricle is going to come down and you're going to go towards ventricular diastole. So that is when so this is why when you remember your cardiac cycle, you can go ahead and you can identify AV valves are opening, AV valves are closing, and semilunar valve is opening. Semilunar valves open, the aortic pressure starts to increase, semilunar valves close, and then again the system goes towards diastole. So this is what the graph of it actually looks like. So when we are going to talk about it, you guys already know from your IG, if you guys remember, that the left ventricle has a much thicker wall compared to the right ventricle. That is because the right ventricle only has to push the blood towards the lungs. The left ventricle has to push the blood throughout the entire body. And as a result, what is going to happen? You need to have thicker muscles on your left side than on your right side. The reason you do not need high pressure on the right side is that if the pressure on the right side was too high, if the right side of the heart was pushing out the blood too high with too much force, what would happen? Fluid would start to accumulate in the lungs because you're putting so much pressure. The fluid would move out of the capillaries into the lungs. The fluid would accumulate in the lungs, and as a result, gas exchange would not take place. The left ventricle, on the other hand, has to have a thick muscle because it has to make sure that it is developing enough pressure and enough force so that the blood can go through the entire body, even against gravity towards the head and neck. It can go ahead and it can do that. So when you are going to talk about it, that is why you definitely need to have a left ventricle, so it just develops enough force so that it can send the blood throughout the body even against gravity. Not only that, when you're going to talk about vigorous exercise, when you're exercising, the arterioles supplying blood to the muscles, all of your arteries that are supplying blood to the muscles, they will have to dilate so they can increase the blood flow. When you're exercising, your arteries are going to dilate to increase the blood flow. So the left ventricle must have enough muscle to be able to send the blood with enough force to make sure that blood is reaching all of the organs, all of the other organs. Because what is happening, that the arteries that are going to the muscles, they are dilating. So the blood is being diverting towards the muscles. But what we want is we want to make sure that the blood is still going to all of the other organs. So that is another reason why the left ventricle must have a thick wall. Another reason why the left ventricle must have a thick wall is because of kidneys. Kidneys require high pressure because kidneys do ultrafiltration. If you guys remember your IGCSE, when you guys did the topic of excretion, remember the first part was ultrafiltration, when the blood was coming with high pressure and all of the tissue fluid, all of the glucose, all of the urea, everything was being forced out into the kidney. So before that, you also need to have a much greater, thicker wall on the left side than on the right side. So that is why you need to have thicker, that is the reasons why left ventricle has a thicker wall on the compared to the right side. Any confusion so far? Does anybody want to ask anything?
No, no.
Okay. Then when we are going to talk about it, so the heart is actually made up of something known as cardiac muscle. Okay. So when you are going to talk about your cardiac muscle, you actually don't need to go into details of it, but I will go ahead and give you a general sort of an idea. So when you're going to talk about your cardiac muscle generally has sort of a branched structure. Okay. And basically, when you're going to talk about it, of course, they have a nucleus and they have got your connective tissue, which has got fibers, collagen fibers, elastic fibers, all of those things. Now, one thing you guys are going to go ahead and notice over here that's really interesting. First thing, you see these cords, these are tendons, okay? They're tendons that are actually responsible for holding the valves shut. They are the ones that are responsible for holding the valve shut. If there is any problem with the tendons, that can affect the valves, and that can end up causing problems in the cardiac cycle and end up causing problems for the heart. Now, when I talk to you, you guys will notice something very special over here. This spot, this spot that they have drawn over here, this is known as the sinoatrial node. When we talk about heart muscle has a very special property. It is myogenic. Okay. That, what do I mean by myogenic? That it will naturally contact and relax. It does not need to receive impulses from a nerve to make it contract. It does not need nervous stimulation,
Yes.
right? It does not need nervous stimulation to the heart.
Yes.
The heart is, yeah.
Is it the only organ that will do this on its own, like naturally?
It's not the only muscle that is myogenic,
Oh,
but when you're going to talk about it, this is when you compare it to other types of muscles. So right now this might not make a lot of sense, but later on, not this year, I think next year in your A levels, when you do the topic of your coordination muscles and all that, so you'll study about skeletal muscles and smooth muscles and cardiac muscles and all that over here. So then it will be a bit more relevant to you. Right now what you need to know is that cardiac muscle is myogenic. Okay, which means that it will naturally contract and it will relax. It does not need to receive impulses from a nerve to make it contract. In fact, if you take a cardiac muscle and you put it in a warm oxygenated solution with all the nutrients and everything inside, it will start to contract and relax by itself. Okay, so
yeah.
that is what I mean by myogenic. But when we talk about our muscles, you can go ahead and always say to me, okay miss, fine, but what about the heart rate? The muscles are contracting by themselves, but what about the heart rate, right? The entire muscles are contracting at the same time. The muscles of the atria, because the muscles are muscle cells, right? So the muscle cells of the atria, each cell, each individual cell is contracting at the same time. And not only is it contracting at the same time, all of this is happening in a specific sequence. First, your atria is going to contract, then the ventricle is going to contract. It is happening in a specific sequence. So you can always go ahead and ask me, okay ma'am, if there's no nervous control, then how is this regulated? How is it so that first of all, the entire heart, all of the muscle cells contract at the same time? And secondly, it is happening in a specific sequence without nervous control. How can this happen? Right? I mean, think about it quite seriously, that if the contractions were not happening in a particular sequence, if the ventricle was contracting before the atria, think of how haphazard your cardiac cycle would be and how badly your cardiac cycle is going to be. And this is actually something that can happen. You have got certain people whose heart, the problem in the heart is that it has got irregular rhythms. It is beating irregularly, it's not beating regularly, right? That can also happen. So there must be some nervous aspect to it. There must be some nervous control. So when you're going to talk about it, this is because of a specialized patch of muscle. We have a specialized patch of muscle that is related to the nervous system. There are no nerves. Let me make that clear. No sensory nerve, no motor nerve, nothing. Instead, we have a special group of muscles, and that group of muscle is known as, over here, the one that starts the entire cycle. The one that starts the entire cycle is known as the sinoatrial node. Okay. We can also call it the pacemaker of the heart. This is also known as the pacemaker of the heart, or it is known as the sinoatrial node. So this is not a nervous thing. This is a muscle tissue, but it's a specialized muscle tissue. So what happens? The muscle cells of the sinoatrial node set the rhythm for all the other cardiac muscle. So this will set the rhythm that will dictate the movement of all of the cardiac muscle. So what is going to happen? Each time the muscles of the sinoatrial node are going to contract, they will set up a wave of electrical activity. So what's going to happen? That this sinoatrial node is going to contract. And as it is going to contract, it's going to send this electrical activity throughout the atrial valves. As a result, the atrial valves are going to contract at the same rhythm as the node. Whatever rhythm the node is contracting at, so if the node contracts, at the same time, the entire atrial valves are going to contract and your atria is going to contract. Right now, what happens? You guys know perfectly well that first the atrium contracts and then the ventricle. How is this regulated? How do they make sure that first the atria and then the ventricle? Okay, this delay is caused by a feature of the heart that briefly delays the excitation wave in its passage from atria to the ventricle. Okay, so generally we have this band of fibers that is present, this band of fibers that is present between the atria and the ventricle. The function of the band of fiber is to, delay this excitation, this electrical impulse. So the electrical impulse will pass through the atria, but it will not be able to pass through the band of the fibers, or it will basically stay within the atria. Okay. So it is going to stay within the atria. Why is this important? So that first the atria are going to contract. Okay. Then what is going to happen after that? So after that, there is a bundle of fibers that do not let the ventricle impulses pass onto the ventricle. So how does the ventricle contract? Basically, these electrical impulses are only able to pass to the ventricle through one way. They cannot go to the ventricle from any other way. Okay, these electrical impulses can only travel to the ventricle in one way, and that is through the septum. In the septum, we have these conducting fibers, and those conducting fibers are the only ones that will allow the electrical impulse to the pass to the atrium. Now, when we are going to talk about it, what is going to happen? That what are these electrical conducting fibers? What are the fibers in the septum that will allow the electrical impulse to pass onto the ventricle? The atrioventricular node. Atrioventricular node is going to be present in the septum. So that atrioventricular node will pick up on the excitation wave, and what is going to happen? That it is going to pick it up, and after that it is going to pass it on to a bunch of conducting fibers. Okay, so over here you will have the atrioventricular node, AVN we call it, and from it will pass on to a bunch of conducting fibers. These conducting fibers are known as Purkinje tissue, Purkyne, Purkinje tissue. And what is going to happen? These Purkinje tissue run down the septum and into the walls of the ventricle. So what's going to happen? The electrical impulse will pass onto the AV node. From there, it is going to travel into the Purkinje tissue, and it is going to travel rapidly down the septum into the ventricles. And as it is going to pass into the ventricles are going to contract. This is how the heart beats rhythmically. This is why first the atrial contract and then the ventricular contract. Starts where? It starts with the sinoatrial node or the SA node, SAN. which is also known as the natural pacemaker of the heart. Now, what happens that this sinoatrial node is going to contract and send out a wave of excitation, send out a wave of electrical impulse that will spread throughout the atria. But it will not go to the ventricle. Why? Because there is a band of fibers preventing it from passing on to the ventricles. So first, your atria are going to contract. Then then the electrical impulse will reach the AV node, and when it will reach the AV node, after a short delay, after a short gap, it will pass on to the Purkinje fibers. When it will pass on to the Purkinje fibers, from it will travel down to the septum into the walls of the ventricle, and the ventricle is going to contract. So this is how the rhythm of the heart is actually going to be controlled. This is how the entire thing actually takes place. And when we are going to talk about it, this is the natural rhythm of the heart. And if there's any problem in the natural rhythm of the heart, if there's any problem in this entire process, the contractions can go wrong. The heart can start to beat irregularly. When the heart is beating irregularly, we call it fibrillation. If you guys watch any of the medical shows, any of the medical dramas, you would have heard that they say, oh, the heart is in VFib, or the heart is in fibrillation, the heart is going in VFib. It's like quite common, and then they go in with the they go in with the CPR, or they go in with the to shock the patient. So when they say it in the medical dramas, that, oh, the patient is in VFib, this is what they mean, that the ventricles are in fibrillation. They are not beating properly because there's some problem with the rhythm. So they try to shock the patient to get it to beat properly again. Okay. So this is how the entire heart muscle is regulated, how the contraction of the heart is controlled, and it happens in a very specific manner. Any confusion in this?
Miss, is this and cardiac arrest the same thing?
All clear?
Is this and cardiac arrest the same thing?
Cardiac arrest is generally when the heart stops beating entirely. Okay, so when the heart stops beating entirely, that is considered to be cardiac arrest. And when we talk about cardiac arrest, remember this, that in cardiac arrest you cannot shock the patient back. Okay. Cardiac arrest generally happens, for example, at the imagine that you guys have studied coronary heart disease in your IG, right? So, well, let's say that there was a coronary heart disease, the arteries were blocked, coronary arteries were blocked, and as a result, the blood was not able to reach the cardiac muscle. So the cardiac muscle will start to die, and when the cardiac muscle is going to die, it will stop beating, and that causes cardiac arrest. So in cardiac arrest, generally, when you have a heart attack, and when especially when you end up getting a flat line. So when you have a heart monitor and you're getting a flat line, no heart activity whatsoever, you cannot shock the patient, you have to perform CPR. That is a misconception, that when you have a flat line, you can go ahead and you can shock the patient back to heart back to working. You cannot. You have to do a CPR. CPR is generally what is done when the heart stops beating. When the heart is beating irregularly, that is generally when you go ahead and you actually shock the patient, because the shock can return the heart rhythm back to normal, but you can't really shock the rhythm to start again. So that is generally what the concept is. Now, when you're going to talk about it, you can monitor this entire electrical activity that I just told you guys about. This entire activity can be monitored by something known as an ECG. ECG is known as electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram, it measures the electrical activity of your heart. So in any situation where you have had, even if you have had recently had a cardiac arrest, or the patient has recently had a heart attack, the ECG will show it. The ECG shows it. So the ECG generally looks like this. Okay, this is the general way the ECG looks like. This is known as the P wave. Okay. This is known as QRS complex, this entire thing. We look at this in the same time. This is known as QRS complex, and then this is known as the T wave. So the P wave is when the atria is contracting. When your atria is contracting, that will be considered as the P wave. QRS complex, that is when the ventricle is contracting, and the T wave is for diastole or relaxation. So P wave is for atrial contraction. This entire QRS complex is for ventricular contraction. And this is basically the recovery phase when the everything is relaxing. So that is all you need to know about ECG. You guys don't need to go into details related to your ECG. So this is basically what you guys have to know about your heart. This is everything that you have to know related to your heart. Okay. Now that we are done talking about our heart, you and I need to go ahead and go over so we have to go over certain things in the entire topic. The entire topic can be divided into three categories. First of all is related to your heart and cardiac cycle. Then you have your blood vessels, and then you have the actual components of the blood. So this time when we're going to do the components of the blood, one thing we have to talk about in detail is hemoglobin. So this time we're going to talk about hemoglobin and its relation with oxygen in more detail compared to what you guys have done before. So let's go ahead, before we get into that, let's go ahead and go over our blood vessels. Blood vessels is something I'm sure you guys know quite well because you guys have done it before. When we are talking about blood vessels, there are three major blood vessels: arteries, vein, and capillaries. Arteries will carry the blood away from the heart. They carry deoxygenated blood away from the heart, right? That's what you and I know. They carry oxygenated blood. There are two exceptions to this. One is pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood. Okay. And secondly is the umbilical artery. The umbilical artery also carries deoxygenated blood. It carries deoxygenated blood from the fetus towards the mother. And when we are going to talk about our, that is our artery, then we have our vein. Vein is carrying the blood towards the heart, right? The vein carries the blood towards the heart, deoxygenated blood towards the heart. Two exceptions again, pulmonary vein and umbilical vein. Umbilical vein will carry oxygenated blood from the mother to the fetus. So generally, when we're going to go ahead and talk about the entire thing, let's start with the structure of the artery. So if you guys remember, artery has a thick muscular wall. Now, this time when we talk about the muscular wall, we are going to divide the muscular wall into three parts. The innermost part of the vascular wall of the heart is known as your tunica. Tunica is the term we use for wall, and intima. Intima means inside. Tunica intima is the innermost surface of the wall. When we're going to talk about this is not just for arteries, it's for veins and veins as well. Okay. Tunica intima basically consists of your endothelium. What is the endothelium? Endothelium is the lining of the blood vessels. Okay, so the cells that are lining the blood vessels, the cells that are present at the outermost layer or the outermost innermost region, they are known as the endothelium. Just like in the skin, we have epithelial cells. So the topmost cells of your blood vessel are known as the endothelium cells, specific name for them. Okay, so they're like epithelial cells, but we say endothelium because they are for blood vessels. So tunica intima is made up of endothelial cells, and generally your endothelial cells are smooth and they are flattened. Then in the middle of it, you are going to go ahead and you're going to have tunica media. Media, of course, because it is present in the center. Tunica media contains the elastic fibers. It contains collagen fibers. It contains your smooth muscles. And when you're going to talk about it, the outermost layer is going to be known as the tunica externa. Tunica externa contains elastic fibers and collagen fibers. So tunica media has three things: smooth muscle, collagen, and elastic fibers. Tunica externa has elastic fibers and collagen fibers mainly. So you guys remember from your IG that your arteries have a narrow lumen and they have a thick, strong muscular wall. Why do they have the thick, strong muscular wall? Because they have to be able to withstand the high blood pressure. And why do they have so many elastic fibers? Because they need to be able to undergo elastic recoil. That means that whenever they're going to the artery is going to stretch out because of high blood pressure, it needs to be able to recoil and come back to the original size. So you need elastic recoil. That is why we have so many elastic fibers, and we need to have thick muscular wall to be able to withstand the high blood pressure. We need to have a narrow lumen to make sure we maintain this high blood pressure, to make sure that this high blood pressure is basically maintained so that the blood can flow to all parts of the body very easily. So when you are going to talk about it, to tuna media, this one, tuna media is generally the thickest part of the wall. So from all three, tuna media is the thickest, and it contains large amounts of elastic fibers, which is what allows the elastic recoil. Okay. So when you're going to talk about it, if you guys remember, you have, so your artery, if you remember, an artery can branch to give you smaller branches, right? An artery can branch to give you smaller branches, and those smaller branches are known as arterioles. So generally the blood vessels that are close to the heart, they have a lot of elastic fibers. Then when you get to the arteries that are far away from the heart, that are in the legs or in the feet or whatever, when you get to the arterioles, they generally have less elastic fiber because by then the pressure has gone down a little bit. And the elasticity of the artery wall is very important in allowing it to be able to withstand that pulse, right? So every time the blood is going to be pumped out of the heart, a pulse is going to pass through the, you're going to get your pulse. And in that, high pressure is going to pass through the artery. So the artery has to be able to stretch when that high blood pressure passes through. And as the blood pressure falls down, the artery should be able to return back to its normal thing. So this is going to basically be your elastic recoil. And when you are going to talk about it, you are going to, I told you that arteries are going to, when your arteries reach the tissues, like the muscles of the leg and all, they actually give multiple small branches, which are known as arterioles. Arterioles will have the same structure, tuna externa, tuna intima, tuna media, but they are going to have lesser elastic fibers and more smooth muscles. So less elastic fibers and more smooth muscles. Why do they have more smooth muscles? So that the arterioles can contract. So the arterioles can contract, which will decrease the diameter of the arteriole. So the blood flow will reduce. So this helps in controlling the volume of blood flow. This helps in controlling how much blood you're allowing to go into the tissue, because you need to be able to control it. You need to be able to control how much blood is going to the muscles, right? So that is basically because of these arterioles. The arterioles have less elastic fibers but more smooth muscles. Those smooth muscles are going to go ahead and they're going to be able to contract or relax, and as a result control the amount of blood actually passing on. So this is what you have to know about your arteries. Now, what happens that this is basically how it looks like. Okay, so you can see that aorta, the largest artery in our body, has the greatest number of elastic fibers, and it has got less number of smooth muscles. You get to a medium-sized artery. A medium-sized artery has a great number of elastic, slightly lesser elastic fibers and more smooth. So that is what happens. Then we need to talk about our capillaries. So our arteries will branch into arterioles, and the arterioles will give you further branches that will give you capillaries. Okay. So when you're going to talk about it, the function of what is the main function of the capillaries? Why do we have them? To take the blood as close to the cells as possible. The capillaries will make sure that the blood goes to the cells as close as possible, so there is rapid transfer of substances. So the substances will rapidly transfer between the cells and the blood. So capillaries will form a network throughout every tissue in our body. Every single tissue in our body will get a capillary network. The capillary network are known as capillary beds. Okay, so these capillary beds are everywhere except for the cornea. If you remember, cornea is a part of the eye, and the cartilage. The cartilage in our body and cornea are the only exceptions. Otherwise, everywhere else, we are going to end up with these capillary beds. When you are going to talk about the structure of the capillary is that it has got a single layer of cells. A single layer of endothelial cells. So our lining of the capillary is going to be one cell thick. That's it. There is no tuna intima, no tuna externa, no tunica media, nothing. No smooth muscles, no collagen fibers, no elastic fibers, nothing. All it is going to have is it's going to have one layer of endothelial cells. That's it. That is the lining of a capillary, one layer of endothelial cells. That's the first thing you need to know. Second thing you need to know is that the wall of the capillary is partially permeable. There are gaps present in the cells of the endothelium. There are gaps present between these cells. The gaps between these cells are very important because they allow the exchange of substances. They allow the exchange of substances from the capillary into the surrounding cells. And finally, the lumen of the capillary is very, very narrow. Compared to artery and vein, a capillary has the narrowest lumen out of all of them. In fact, the lumen of a capillary is so small that the red blood cells have to travel in a single line. The lumen of the capillary is the diameter of a red blood cell. That is the diameter. It matches the diameter of a single red blood cells, and the red blood cells will be able to travel in one straight line. Why do we have this particular structure? First of all, the fact that the diameter is so small, lumen is so small, the red blood cells are traveling in one straight line means that the blood flow will be slow. And as a result, the exchange of nutrients can be as optimum, as efficient, as best as possible. Secondly, because the walls are partially permeable, because they have these gaps, so that allows quick exchange of nutrients, and also it allows your white blood cells to be able to squeeze through and go to the tissue and fight if there is any kind of infection. And the fact that your cell wall is so thin, I'm saying cell wall, I mean capillary wall is so thin means that the distance for diffusion will be less, so that diffusion will take place quickly. So this is what we need to know about the structure of capillaries. Any confusion? Does anybody want to ask anything?
No, miss.
Is this all clear?
Yes, miss. Yes, miss.
Okay, guys, so we're going to go ahead and stop it